Why did a handful of dried kernels become the soundtrack to every American movie, the aroma that defines county fairs, and the one snack that survived when everything else disappeared? How did indigenous peoples figure out that certain corn kernels would explode into edible clouds thousands of years before anyone understood the physics? And what made this ancient discovery transform into a 17 billion quart per year obsession? When you really think about it, isn't it strange that we celebrate explosions in our food? Here's the thing though. If you traveled back 6,000 years to taste that first popped kernel, you'd probably spit it out. No butter, no salt, just a slightly charred, crunchy flour of starch that probably tasted more like smoke than snack. The archaeological evidence suggests those early poppers weren't exactly aiming for movie theater perfection. They were probably just trying not to burn their fingers over an open fire. As we journey through popcorn's remarkable story, you'll discover surprising truths about breakfast bowls in the 1800s, desperate theater owners in the Depression, and why sugar rationing during World War II accidentally created America's favorite snack tradition. Along the way, these small revelations might just help your thoughts settle, like kernels finally coming to rest at the bottom of an empty bowl, quiet and still after all that popping is done. Feel absolutely welcome to subscribe if these bedtime histories help you unwind, though there's never any pressure. Just do whatever feels right for your nighttime routine. I'd love to know, what's your earliest popcorn memory? Maybe it's a specific theater, a carnival, or just making it at home with someone special. Drop a comment below with your story. Before we begin tonight's journey, take a moment to adjust your space for comfort. Maybe fluff that pillow just right, let your shoulders sink into the mattress, and if you're someone who sleeps better with a slight coolness, consider lowering the temperature just a degree or two. Let the day's tensions melt away as we travel back to ancient Peru, where our story begins. You're standing in what archaeologists now call Bat Cave. Though 6,000 years ago in Peru, it wasn't called anything at all. The indigenous peoples who sheltered here, whose names we'll never know, left behind something remarkable in the layers of ancient debris. Tiny ears of corn, some no bigger than your thumbnail, specially cultivated not for eating fresh, but for something else entirely. These weren't the massive corn cobs we know today. These were primitive maize ears with kernels wrapped in hard shells, kernels that held a secret. The evidence from 4,700 BC tells us these ancient peoples had already discovered what would take European scientists until the 20th century to fully understand, that certain varieties of corn, when heated just right, would violently transform. They'd figured out that moisture trapped inside, combined with a hard outer shell called the pericarp, would create something magical. Though of course, they didn't think about moisture percentages or pressure dynamics. They just knew that when you held these special kernels over the fire, something extraordinary happened. Picture them gathered around their fires, probably using clay pots or hot sand, techniques we can only partially reconstruct from the archaeological remains. The popping must have seemed like pure magic. kernels jumping and dancing, transforming from hard seeds into white flowers. Some researchers believe, based on burn patterns found on ancient pottery, that they might have used special clay vessels with narrow necks, designed specifically to contain the jumping kernels while letting steam escape. Honestly, that's more sophisticated than my first apartment's kitchen setup. What's particularly fascinating, and this is where archaeologists start disagreeing, is whether popcorn was discovered accidentally or intentionally. Some scholars suggest it began when kernels accidentally fell into cooking fires, while others point to evidence of deliberate cultivation of popping varieties as early as 3600 BCE in New Mexico's own Bat Cave, suggesting indigenous peoples were already selecting and breeding corn specifically for its popping qualities. The debate continues in academic journals, though the ancient poppers themselves probably didn't care much about who got credit. They were just enjoying their crunchy discovery. You can trace the spread of popcorn knowledge through the Americas by following the archaeological remains, tiny burned kernels and distinctively damaged pottery spreading northward and southward from Central America. By 2500 BCE, evidence appears from Chile to the American Southwest, suggesting this knowledge traveled along ancient trade routes we're only beginning to understand. Each culture added their own techniques, their own traditions, their own meanings to the popping process. In coastal Peru, archaeologists have found preserved popcorn in ancient tombs, placed there as food for the journey to the afterlife. Think about that for a moment. These people valued popcorn enough to bury it with their dead. The preservation is so remarkable that some kernels, after thousands of years, still show their popped structure perfectly intact, frozen in time like edible fossils. It makes you wonder, did they believe the dead could hear that familiar pop in the afterlife? The varieties they grew were incredibly diverse, something modern agricultural scientists find astounding. Where we might recognize 2 or 3 types of popcorn, ancient farmers cultivated dozens of varieties, each with different popping characteristics. Some produce tiny, dense pops, others larger, fluffier explosions. Archaeological evidence suggests, based on kernel size and shape variations, that indigenous farmers were sophisticated geneticists, selecting and crossbreeding for specific traits millennia before Mendel ever thought about pea plants. Recent discoveries in Mexico, particularly in the Tehuacan Valley, have revealed something even more intriguing. Microscopic analysis of ancient pottery residue shows traces of lime treatment on popcorn remains, suggesting these ancient peoples had discovered nixtamalization, the process of treating corn with alkali to increase its nutritional value, and were applying it to popcorn. This means they weren't just snacking. They were creating a nutritionally complete food that could sustain entire populations. The dating techniques keep getting more precise, and with each refinement, popcorn gets older. What we thought was 4,000 years old in the 1950s turned out to be 5,000 years old in the 1980s, and now with better carbon dating, we're pushing 6,000 years or more. Every few years, it seems, popcorn's history gets a little longer, a little more ancient, a little more fundamental to the human story in the Americas. By the time the Aztec and Maya civilizations rose to prominence, popcorn had transcended its role as mere food. But that transformation, that elevation from snack to sacred object, well, that's where things get even more interesting. The Spanish conquistadors who first witnessed these ceremonies, they could barely believe their eyes. You're watching through the eyes of Bernardino de Sajan, a Spanish friar documenting Aztec life in the 1540s, and what you're seeing defies every European understanding of food and worship. The Aztecs are dancing, wearing elaborate headdresses adorned with strings of popped corn that cascade like white waterfalls around their faces. These aren't random decorations. Each strand has been carefully threaded, each kernel selected for its perfect flowering shape, creating garlands that catch the firelight and seem to glow against their dark hair. The ceremonies honoring Tlaloc, the rain god, involve something even more remarkable. Young women are tossing handfuls of popped corn into the air, creating white clouds that drift down like snow, or perhaps like the rain they're praying for. The Spanish chroniclers describe it with a mixture of fascination and confusion, calling the popped kernels mamaquitl in their attempts to capture the Nahuatl word, though they keep comparing it to European foods that don't quite fit, like dried flowers that are edible. One writes, similar to our wheat puffs but from maize. Attempts another. You can almost feel their frustration, trying to describe something their language has no words for. What the conquistadors didn't initially understand, and this is documented in multiple Spanish accounts from the period, was that popcorn held deep spiritual significance. The Aztecs believed the popping sound was the corn spirit speaking, releasing prayers directly to the gods. Some ceremonies required absolute silence except for the popping itself, letting the kernels do all the talking. Imagine standing in those torchlit temples, hundreds of people holding their breath, listening to corn kernels burst like tiny thunderclaps, each pop carrying a message skyward. According to the Florentine Codex, which Sahan spent decades compiling, popcorn appeared in at least 16 different religious ceremonies throughout the Aztec calendar year. The young god Huitzilopochtli wore popcorn garlands during his festival, while dancers dressed as corn spirits threw popped kernels at spectators, who tried to catch them in their mouths for good luck. If you missed, well, apparently that meant a year of agricultural disappointment. No pressure there. The Aztec merchants, the Pactica, carried popcorn on their long trading journeys, not just as food, but as a trade item that could survive months of travel without spoiling. Archaeological evidence from trade routes suggests, based on pottery shards and carbonized kernel remains, that popcorn moved thousands of miles across Mesoamerica. Unlike fresh corn that would rot, or dried corn that attracted pests, popped corn stayed light, portable, and relatively unspoiled. Think of it as the ancient world's original travel snack, though without the convenience store markup. You can trace popcorn's ceremonial importance through the artwork too. The murals at Teotihuacan, painted centuries before the Aztec Empire even existed, show figures wearing what archaeologists believe are popcorn ornaments. The Mayan Dresden Codex, one of only 4 surviving pre-Columbian books, includes glyphs that some scholars interpret as references to popped maize in divination rituals. Though there's ongoing academic debate about these interpretations, the visual evidence keeps accumulating. What's particularly intriguing, and historians are still arguing about this, is whether the Spanish actually helped spread popcorn or tried to suppress it. Some accounts suggest Catholic priests banned popcorn from churches, associating it with pagan rituals. Other documents indicate Spanish colonists quickly adopted popcorn for their own celebrations, especially during Christmas festivities. The contradiction probably means both happened, depending on who was in charge and how strictly they interpreted religious doctrine. The indigenous peoples of Peru had their own popcorn traditions, completely different from the Aztec ceremonies. Spanish chronicles from the 1550s describe Inca nobles eating popcorn sweetened with honey during royal feasts, served in golden bowls that caught the light. The preparation method sounds almost modern. They used special ceramic pots with perforated lids, essentially creating the world's first popcorn poppers. These pots, called tostadors, have been found in archaeological sites from Ecuador to Chile, suggesting this technology spread across the entire Incan road system. In the northern regions, among the Pueblo peoples of what's now New Mexico and Arizona, popcorn took on different meanings entirely. According to oral histories recorded centuries later, but believed to describe ancient practices, popcorn was used in rain ceremonies similar to the Aztec traditions, but also in coming-of-age rituals. Young people would hold kernels in their hands over the fire, waiting for them to pop, as a test of courage and patience. The first pop meant you were ready for adult responsibilities, though I imagine quite a few kernels got dropped when they started jumping. The variety of popping techniques across different cultures reveals sophisticated understanding of heat and moisture. The Zapotec people of Oaxaca used hot sand in clay vessels, creating even heat distribution that modern food scientists say produces superior popping. The Cherokee, according to ethnographic accounts from the 1800s that likely describe much older practices, used hot ashes mixed with kernels, then sifted out the popped corn. Each method produced different textures, different flavors, different ceremonial meanings. Spanish colonial records from the 1560s mention indigenous vendors selling popcorn in the markets of Mexico City, suggesting it had already become a commercial product beyond its ceremonial uses. The price lists from these markets, preserved in colonial administrative documents, show popcorn cost about the same as cacao beans, which were literally used as currency. That's right, popcorn was worth its weight in money, though considerably lighter. The religious syncretism that developed, mixing Catholic and indigenous traditions, created entirely new popcorn customs. In some regions of colonial Mexico, popcorn became associated with Day of the Dead celebrations, offered to deceased ancestors alongside European bread and indigenous tamales. This blend of traditions, documented in church records that tried to control or incorporate local practices, shows how deeply embedded popcorn had become in cultural identity. But perhaps the most telling detail comes from a Spanish nun's letter home in 1572, where she mentions teaching indigenous children to string popcorn for Christmas decorations, having learned the technique from their mothers who used it for other celebrations. Neither culture realized they were creating a tradition that would someday appear on Christmas trees from Berlin to Boston, though that part of the story, that journey across the Atlantic, would take several more centuries to unfold. You're standing in a colonial kitchen in Virginia, sometime in the 1620s, watching an English housewife stare suspiciously at a handful of small, hard kernels her indigenous neighbor has just handed her. The woman has already learned to grow corn. That was essential for survival. But this bizarre instruction to throw perfectly good corn into the fire until it explodes? The historical records from Jamestown and Plymouth suggest most colonists initially viewed popcorn as a curiosity, something the natives did that seemed wasteful of good grain. The earliest documented reference to colonists actually eating popcorn appears in French explorers' journals from the Great Lakes region in the 1610s. Where they describe Iroquois peoples making popcorn soup by adding popped kernels to bear fat and maple syrup. The French seemed more adventurous than their English counterparts, or perhaps just hungrier, because they actually tried it and wrote favorably about the taste. Though one imagines bear fat soup requires a certain acquired palate. What's fascinating about the colonial adoption of popcorn, and this is where historians really start disagreeing, is how slowly it happened compared to other Native American foods. Corn itself? Adopted immediately for survival. Squash and beans? Absolutely essential. But popcorn? The evidence suggests it took nearly a century for most colonial communities to regularly consume it. Some scholars argue this was due to religious associations with native ceremonies. Others point to the practical difficulty of getting the right type of corn, since not all corn pops and colonists kept planting the wrong varieties. The famous Thanksgiving popcorn story, the one every American school child used to learn, needs addressing here. According to the legend, Quatakina, brother of Chief Massasoit, brought a deerskin bag of popped corn to the first Thanksgiving in 1621. It's a charming story, perfect for elementary school pageants, completely without any historical documentation whatsoever. The myth appears to have been invented in the 1880s, possibly by a popcorn company looking for marketing material. The actual menu from that feast, reconstructed from colonial accounts, included wildfowl, venison, and various vegetables, but no mention of popcorn anywhere. By the 1700s, colonial housewives' receipt books, what they called cookbooks, began showing scattered references to parched corn that jumps. A Virginia plantation record from 1735 mentions purchasing popping corn seed from indigenous traders, suggesting specialized varieties were being deliberately cultivated for colonial markets. The going rate? About 3 times the price of regular corn seed, which tells you something about supply and demand. The religious complications around popcorn make for peculiar reading in colonial documents. Some Puritan ministers, according to sermon records from the 1650s, denounced popcorn as the devil's corn because of its explosive nature and association with native spirituality. Others, particularly Quaker communities in Pennsylvania, embraced it as one of God's mysterious wonders. There's a delightful account from 1673 of a Quaker meeting where someone brought popcorn, and the sudden popping during silent prayer caused quite a theological discussion about divine signs versus earthly snacks. Dutch colonists in New Amsterdam, later New York, seem to have fewer religious qualms about popcorn. Peter Stuyvesant's administrative records from the 1660s include complaints about street vendors selling corn that pops outside churches, suggesting it had already become a commercial snack in urban areas. The Dutch called it POF maize, which sounds like something you'd order at a trendy restaurant today, though probably tasted significantly less artisanal. The gradual acceptance of popcorn in colonial America traced interesting geographic patterns. Coastal settlements with more indigenous contact adopted it faster, while inland communities sometimes didn't encounter it for decades. A Massachusetts diary from 1698 describes the writer's first encounter with popcorn at age 40, calling it a most peculiar transformation of maize that frightened my grandchildren, but delighted them upon tasting. You can picture those kids, probably the same ones who were supposed to be churning butter, sneaking kernels to pop over the kitchen fire when grandmother wasn't looking. The indigenous peoples themselves, meanwhile, watched with what must have been amusement as colonists struggled with basic popping techniques. Multiple colonial journals describe failed attempts, burned kernels, kitchen fires, and corn explosions that sent hot kernels flying across wooden homes. The learning curve was steep and occasionally dangerous. A Rhode Island court record from 1704 actually documents a house fire caused by improper corn popping procedures, which might be history's first popcorn-related insurance claim. The varieties of corn also caused endless confusion. Colonists kept trying to pop their field corn, which has too much moisture and too soft a hull, leading to disappointment and waste. Indigenous traders, recognizing a business opportunity, began selling specific popping varieties at premium prices. By the 1720s, seed catalogs from Philadelphia merchants listed Indian popping corn as a separate category, though the descriptions suggest they still didn't fully understand what made it special. Trade records from the period reveal something interesting about cultural exchange. While colonists were slowly learning to pop corn, indigenous peoples were adapting European metal pots for better popping results. Archaeological sites from the early 1700s show indigenous communities using modified Dutch ovens and English kettles specifically for popcorn production, creating hybrid technologies that worked better than either culture's original methods. The first colonial popcorn entrepreneur we can identify by name was Timothy Thornton of Boston, who in 1743 placed newspaper advertisements for Thornton's celebrated popping corn, prepared in the Indian manner but suited for English tastes. What exactly made it suited for English tastes remains unclear, though probably involved less spare fat and more butter, assuming they could afford butter. Religious tensions around popcorn persisted well into the 1750s. There's a wonderful letter from Benjamin Franklin, who seemed to have opinions about everything, suggesting that popcorn's explosive nature was simply the moisture within seeking freedom through heat. A surprisingly accurate scientific explanation wrapped in Enlightenment philosophy. He also noted that children universally loved it regardless of their parents' theological concerns, which he found amusing and instructive about human nature. By the time of the Revolution, popcorn had become American enough that continental soldiers carried it as rations, though British military records suggest they found this practice bizarre. One British officer's journal from 1778 describes captured American supplies, including peculiar corn that bursts when heated, which the rebels consume with apparent satisfaction. The dismissive tone suggests he never actually tried it, his loss really, because those same rebels were about to win their independence. And their popcorn? Well, it was about to become something much bigger than just a survival snack. You're peering into an American breakfast table in 1848, and what you're seeing would bewilder any modern nutritionist. There's a bowl of popped corn, swimming in fresh cream and maple syrup, being eaten with a spoon by a perfectly respectable Connecticut housewife. This isn't some quirky individual choice. This is mainstream American breakfast culture that somehow everyone forgot about. The evidence appears in dozens of household guides and cookbooks from the period, treating popcorn as a standard morning meal, right alongside porridge and eggs. The earliest cookbook reference we can verify comes from 1846. The American Housewife's Receipt Book by an anonymous author, which includes instructions for popped corn with milk, a wholesome breakfast for children and invalids. The recipe suggests popping the corn the night before, letting it cool, then serving it like we'd serve cereal today. No mention of butter, no salt, just popcorn floating in milk with a touch of molasses or sugar. The author notes it aids digestion and provides substantial nourishment, though what qualified as medical advice in 1846 should probably be taken with, well, a grain of salt. What makes this breakfast phenomenon particularly fascinating, and food historians are still piecing together exactly why, is that Americans were eating popcorn as cereal decades before anyone invented corn flakes. John Harvey Kellogg wouldn't create his famous flakes until 1894. But here were Americans in the 1840s already consuming corn for breakfast, just in its exploded form. Some scholars suggest this was influenced by Native American practices of eating popped corn with bear fat in the morning. Others point to European traditions of eating grains with milk, but the truth is probably somewhere in between. Ella Kellogg, wife of the cornflakes inventor, published Science in the Kitchen in 1893, and she includes 3 different popcorn breakfast recipes. One involves grinding popped corn into a coarse flour and cooking it into porridge. Another suggests mixing popped corn with dried fruits and nuts, essentially creating the first granola. She writes that popcorn, having been subjected to intense heat in the popping process, is more easily digested than ordinary grain preparations. The science was questionable, but the recipe sounds surprisingly modern, like something you'd find at a Brooklyn brunch spot charging $15 a bowl. The popularity of popcorn for breakfast extended across social classes, which is unusual for food trends of the era. Wealthy families in Boston served it in fine china bowls, while frontier families in Ohio ate it from wooden trenchers. A diary from a Michigan lumber camp in 1857 mentions the cook serving popcorn with milk when they ran out of oatmeal, and the lumberjacks actually preferring it. The boys request the popped corn more regular now. The camp foreman wrote, though one wonders if they were just being polite or genuinely enjoyed it. Railroad dining cars in the 1860s, according to preserved menus from the Pennsylvania Railroad, offered popped corn and cream as a breakfast option for 5 cents. This wasn't some novelty item. It appeared on standard menus between wheat cakes and boiled eggs. The railroad companies even published pamphlets explaining to European travelers that this was a typical American breakfast food, though whether any visiting dignitaries actually ordered it remains undocumented. The Civil War created an unexpected boost for popcorn breakfasts. Union soldiers, according to letters home that historians have compiled, received packages of popped corn from family members because it traveled well and lasted longer than bread. They'd eat it dry when necessary, but preferred to soak it in water or milk when available. One particularly poignant letter from 1863 describes a soldier sharing his popcorn breakfast with Confederate prisoners, noting they'd never seen corn prepared this way, suggesting the breakfast tradition was more northern than southern. Women's magazines of the 1870s promoted popcorn as an ideal breakfast for children. Godey's Lady's Book, the most popular women's magazine of the era, published an article in 1871 claiming that children who ate popcorn for breakfast exhibited superior dental health and regular digestion. The evidence for these claims was entirely anecdotal, but mothers across America apparently believed it. Sales records from general stores in the period show popcorn sales highest in winter months, when hot breakfast cereals were most popular. The mechanization of popcorn production in the 1870s made breakfast popcorn even more accessible. Mills in Iowa and Illinois began selling pre-popped corn in sealed containers, marketed specifically for breakfast use. Crunchy kernels for the morning meal advertised one brand in 1878. though the spelling suggests marketing sophistication hadn't quite caught up with manufacturing capability. These early attempts at packaged breakfast foods, historians note, laid groundwork for the entire ready-to-eat cereal industry. There's ongoing academic debate about why popcorn breakfast disappeared so thoroughly from American culture. Some food historians argue that the invention of corn flakes and other processed cereals simply offered more convenience. Others suggest that increasing urbanization made fresh popping less practical. The most intriguing theory, proposed by culinary anthropologist Sarah Lohman, is that popcorn became so associated with entertainment and leisure by the early 1900s that it ceased to be seen as serious breakfast food. Medical opinions of the era varied wildly about popcorn's breakfast benefits. The New England Journal of Medicine published a piece in 1882 suggesting popcorn was too stimulating for morning consumption, while the American Medical Weekly countered in 1884 that it was superior to all other grain preparations for the first meal. Reading these conflicting medical opinions, you realize doctors have been arguing about breakfast foods for a lot longer than the current intermittent fasting debates. Home economics textbooks from the 1880s still included popcorn breakfast instructions, but with increasing disclaimers. One 1889 manual notes that while popped corn with milk remains popular in rural districts, urban families increasingly prefer manufactured cereals. The shift was gradual but undeniable. By 1895, popcorn had largely moved from the breakfast table to the evening snack bowl. The last major cookbook to seriously promote popcorn for breakfast was the Boston Cooking School Cookbook by Fanny Farmer in 1896, where she includes it almost as an afterthought, noting it was formerly a common breakfast dish, now largely replaced by newer preparations. That word formerly tells the whole story in less than 2 generations. Americans had completely forgotten they once started their days with popped corn. But while popcorn was leaving the breakfast table, something extraordinary was happening on street corners across America. A Chicago inventor was tinkering with a machine that would transform popcorn from a home-popped curiosity into a commercial phenomenon. The year was 1885, and Charles Creeders was about to change everything, though probably not in the way he expected. You're standing on a Chicago street corner in 1885, watching Charles Creeders push a contraption that looks like it escaped from a mad scientist's laboratory. It's part steam engine, part carnival attraction, part kitchen appliance, and all spectacle. The machine has a gasoline burner, a steam boiler, and a peanut roaster alongside the popcorn kettle, because why specialize when you can do everything at once? Creeders is cranking the handle, steam is hissing, and suddenly, kernels are exploding inside the glass case while passers-by stop dead in their tracks, mesmerized by this mechanical theater of snacks. The story of how Creeders invented this machine reveals something about American ingenuity, or perhaps just stubbornness. He'd originally moved from Ohio to Chicago to open a bakery, but that failed. Then he tried a candy shop. That failed too. by 1885. He was repairing peanut roasters for a living when he noticed street vendors struggling with their primitive popping methods. Most were using wire baskets over coal fires, burning as much corn as they popped, sending black smoke into customers' faces. Creeders thought, according to his journal, there must be a better way to make people wait for their snacks. What made Creeder's invention revolutionary wasn't just the popping mechanism, it was the entire experience. The machine had glass windows so customers could watch the kernels transform, a feature that seems obvious now but was marketing genius in 1885. Previous vendors hid the popping process. Creeders turned it into entertainment. His patent application from December 1885 describes a machine that advertises itself by its operation, probably the first recognition that making food could be performance art. The technical innovation was equally impressive. Creeder's steam-powered system maintained consistent temperature, something hand-popping could never achieve. The steam engine powered an agitator that kept kernels moving, preventing burning while ensuring even popping. He'd essentially invented automation for snack food, though the term automation wouldn't exist for another 60 years. Food technology historians consider this machine the ancestor of every commercial food processor, from cotton candy machines to modern factory equipment. The public reaction was immediate and dramatic. The Chicago Tribune reported in 1886 that crowds would gather just to watch the machine operate, sometimes forgetting to actually buy popcorn. One article describes children following Creeder's wagon as if he were the Pied Piper, but with better snacks. The spectacle was so effective that other vendors tried to sue Creeders for unfair competition through mechanical advantage, which might be the 19th century's strangest legal complaint, though the court dismissed it as ridiculous. Creeders faced an unexpected problem. Nobody trusted machine-made food. The 1880s public was deeply suspicious of mechanical preparation, associating it with adulteration and contamination. Newspaper editorials warned about unnatural processing and mechanical interference with wholesome food. To combat this, Creeders would eat the first batch from each day's popping in front of customers, essentially becoming his own quality control department. Some days, according to his business records, he'd eat several pounds of popcorn just to prove it was safe. The competition responded quickly and sometimes desperately. Traditional vendors spread rumors that steam-popped corn caused mechanical indigestion, whatever that meant. Others claimed the gasoline burner left dangerous residues, ignoring that they used coal fires that actually did leave residues. One competitor even hired a man to stand near Creeder's wagon shouting that the popcorn was cursed by machinery, which probably just attracted more curious customers. You can't buy that kind of advertising. By 1893, Creeders had refined his machine for the World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, the same fair that introduced Americans to the Ferris wheel and Cracker Jack. His newest model, painted bright red with brass fittings, could produce 120 pounds of popcorn per hour. The exposition guidebook lists it as one of the mechanical marvels of the age, alongside the first electric kitchen and a machine that made ice cream automatically. Creeder sold his popcorn for 5 cents a bag, the same price it would remain for the next 40 years. The exposition exposed millions to mechanically popped corn, but more importantly, it established popcorn as quintessentially American. Foreign visitors wrote home about this peculiar American snack, often struggling to describe it. A French journalist called it le mas explosive, while a British observer termed it a most peculiar application of steam power to corn. The Japanese delegation, according to their official report, was particularly fascinated, taking detailed technical drawings back to Tokyo, though commercial popcorn wouldn't appear in Japan for another 70 years. Creeder's success spawned an entire industry of imitators and innovators. By 1895, the Sears catalog offered Creeder-style popcorn wagons for $195, about $6,000 in today's money. These weren't just for established vendors. Middle-class entrepreneurs saw popcorn wagons as accessible business opportunities. A wagon could pay for itself in 6 months, according to testimonials Sears published, though they probably cherry-picked the success stories. The social impact went beyond commerce. Popcorn wagons became gathering places, especially in immigrant neighborhoods where they served as informal community centers. Police reports from Chicago in the 1890s note that popcorn wagons were often the only lit areas on dark streets, making them natural meeting spots. Some wagon operators, recognizing this social function, added benches and became unofficial neighborhood fixtures. One operator in Little Italy, according to social reform documents, even helped new immigrants find jobs while they bought popcorn. Labor unions initially opposed mechanical popcorn machines, fearing they'd eliminate jobs. The Popcorn Vendors Association of Chicago, formed in 1894, tried to ban mechanical poppers from certain streets. But Creeder's cleverly hired former hand poppers to operate his machines, essentially upgrading their jobs rather than eliminating them. By 1900, operating a Creeder's machine was considered skilled labor, commanding higher wages than hand popping ever did. The machine's influence extended to agriculture. Farmers began growing specific varieties optimized for mechanical popping, leading to the development of hybrid popcorn strains. Agricultural records from Iowa show that popcorn acreage doubled between 1885 and 1895, directly attributed to urban demand from mechanical poppers. The consistent quality required by machines drove agricultural standardization, making popcorn one of the first crops specifically bred for processing equipment. Medical professionals of the era had mixed reactions to mechanically popped corn. The Journal of American Medicine published a study in 1896 claiming that steam-popped corn was more thoroughly cooked and therefore more digestible, while competing medical journals warned about excessive expansion causing gastric distress. Reading these contradictory medical opinions, it's clear that nobody really understood nutrition yet, but everyone had strong opinions anyway. But the real test of Creeder's revolution would come during America's darkest economic period. As the new century dawned, his machines had spread to every major city. Popcorn had become a standard street snack, and vendors were making steady livings. Nobody could have predicted that in just 30 years, this 5-cent bag of popped corn would become one of the only affordable pleasures in a nation brought to its knees by economic collapse. You're watching a line of people in worn coats shuffle forward in Chicago, Detroit, New York. It's 1932 and they're not queuing for bread or soup. They're counting out pennies, nickels if they're lucky, for one of the only pleasures they can still afford, a 5-cent bag of popcorn. While candy bars and ice cream have become impossible luxuries, while restaurants sit empty and theaters struggle, popcorn vendors are somehow surviving, even thriving. The same economic disaster that destroyed most businesses accidentally turned popcorn into America's most democratic treat. The numbers tell a story that seems impossible. Between 1929 and 1933, when the American economy contracted by 30%, popcorn consumption actually increased by nearly 200%. Agricultural reports from the period show popcorn farming expanded while other crops failed, not because of government subsidies or agricultural innovation, but because desperate Americans needed something, anything, they could still afford to enjoy. A nickel bought you a bag large enough to share, or to make last all afternoon if you ate it kernel by kernel, which many did. What made popcorn depression-proof wasn't just the price, though that certainly helped. It was the profit margin for vendors. The raw corn cost almost nothing, about 2 cents per pound wholesale in 1931, and a pound could make nearly 30 bags. Even selling at 5 cents, vendors could survive on volume. More importantly, popcorn required minimal investment. You didn't need a store, just a wagon or even a basket. You didn't need employees. Family members could help. You didn't need credit from banks that had failed, just enough kernels for tomorrow's popping. The social dynamics around Depression-era popcorn reveals something profound about human nature. Middle-class families who'd lost everything would buy popcorn to maintain some semblance of normalcy, of treating their children. Former executives sold popcorn on the same corners where they'd once caught taxis to work. There's a documented case from Philadelphia, recorded in relief agency files, of a banker who lost everything in the crash and supported his family for 3 years selling popcorn outside his former bank. His old colleagues would buy from him, pretending not to recognize him, preserving everyone's dignity in small acts of willful blindness. Relief organizations noticed something curious. Families receiving food assistance would sometimes trade portions of their rations for popcorn money. Social workers initially tried to stop this, calling it frivolous, until they realized what was really happening. Parents were maintaining children's spirits through small pleasures, preserving family traditions of weekend treats, fighting psychological defeat with 5-cent bags of normalcy. A social worker's report from 1933 Cleveland noted, "The popcorn seems to represent more than food. It's proof that everything hasn't been taken from them." The infrastructure of popcorn sales adapted to economic reality in fascinating ways. Vendors developed elaborate credit systems, letting regular customers pay at week's end when relief checks arrived. Some accepted barter, trading popcorn for everything from shoe repairs to haircuts. In rural areas, farmers would trade raw corn directly for popped corn, cutting out money entirely. These informal economies, documented in Federal Writers' Project interviews, show how communities created survival networks around something as simple as popped corn. Movie theaters initially resisted this popcorn economy, viewing it as beneath their dignity. Through the 1920s, most theaters banned outside food and refused to sell snacks, wanting to maintain an air of sophistication. But by 1930, with attendance plummeting, some theater owners noticed the crowds around popcorn wagons outside their venues. The smart ones started doing math. If every patron bought a 5-cent bag with almost pure profit, that could offset declining ticket sales. The transformation would be gradual, then sudden, then complete. Agricultural extension services began promoting popcorn as a depression crop, suitable for small farms and requiring minimal investment. The USDA published bulletins on popcorn cultivation, noting it could grow on marginal land unsuitable for other crops. A 1934 report called it the democracy of corn varieties, yielding profit from soil that wouldn't support anything else. Farm families could grow it, pop it, and sell it locally without middlemen, creating closed-loop economies that bypass the failed banking system entirely. The variety of popcorn businesses that emerged shows remarkable creativity. There were popcorn pushcarts designed to look like miniature circuses, complete with calliope music from hand-cranked phonographs. Some vendors specialized in flavored varieties, using whatever seasonings they could afford, cheese powder when available, cinnamon during apple season, even pickle juice when nothing else was at hand. A vendor in St. Louis, according to newspaper accounts, created 30 different flavors using ingredients that most people would never consider food additives, though health inspections were fairly relaxed during the Depression. Children became popcorn entrepreneurs in unprecedented numbers. School records from the period show attendance dropping on Friday afternoons, when kids would buy wholesale kernels to pop and sell at weekend events. Some schools actually incorporated popcorn businesses into their curriculum, teaching arithmetic through profit calculations and geography through corn distribution. A principal in Kansas City wrote in 1933 that his students learned more practical mathematics from popcorn sales than from textbooks, though he probably wouldn't admit that to the school board. The technology evolved to meet economic constraints. When commercial poppers broke, vendors couldn't afford repairs, so they improvised. Wire mesh wastebaskets became popping chambers. Metal drums became mobile roasters. Automobile engines provided power for agitators. The Patent Office recorded dozens of popcorn-related inventions between 1930 and 1935. Most filed by individual inventors rather than companies, suggesting grassroots innovation born of necessity. Labor statistics from the period, though incomplete, suggest popcorn vending employed thousands who'd otherwise have no income. Unlike traditional jobs that disappeared entirely, popcorn vending could scale infinitely downward. You could be a professional with multiple wagons and employees, or a child with a basket on a street corner. This flexibility made it impossible for the economy to completely destroy the popcorn trade. It just atomized into smaller and smaller units, each sustainable at its own level. The cultural impact went beyond economics. Popcorn became a symbol of resilience, featured in popular songs, comic strips, and eventually movies about the Depression itself. Will Rogers mentioned popcorn vendors in his columns as examples of American ingenuity. Franklin Roosevelt's campaign stops always included purchasing popcorn from local vendors, a carefully orchestrated photo opportunity that suggested solidarity with small business. Whether he actually ate the popcorn remains undocumented, though photographers always caught him smiling while holding the bag. But the real revolution was just beginning. As vendors gathered outside struggling theaters, and theater owners watched their businesses collapse, someone was about to figure out that the solution to both problems was obvious. The marriage between popcorn and movies, born of mutual desperation, would transform American culture forever. Though first, the theater owners would have to swallow their pride, which for some would prove harder than swallowing popcorn. You're standing in the opulent lobby of the Rivoli Theater in New York. 1927, where the carpet costs more than most people's houses and ushers wear uniforms fancier than military dress. The management has posted signs everywhere. No peanuts, no popcorn, no concessions of any kind. Outside, vendors sell their 5-cent bags to people heading in, who stuff them in pockets and purses like contraband. The theater owners consider this the worst kind of invasion. These palaces built for sophisticated entertainment being infiltrated by the smell of common street food. They have no idea they're fighting a war they've already lost. The resistance from theater owners seems almost comical in hindsight, but you have to understand their mindset. These weren't just movie houses. They were picture palaces designed to rival European opera houses. The Roxy in New York had a 6,000-seat capacity, crystal chandeliers, and a full orchestra. The owners genuinely believed that allowing popcorn would destroy the refined atmosphere they'd spent millions creating. Samuel Roxy Rothafel himself wrote in 1925 that permitting food sales would reduce us to the level of carnival sideshows, which was particularly ironic since many of his customers had encountered movies at exactly those venues. What changed everything was brutal economic mathematics. By 1930, theaters were hemorrhaging money. The Paradise Theater in Chicago, which had cost $4 million to build in 1928, was facing foreclosure by 1931. Attendance had dropped 40%, ticket prices had been slashed, and elaborate stage shows had been eliminated. Meanwhile, the popcorn vendor outside was making enough to support a family of 5. The theater manager, according to his memoirs published years later, would watch from his office window as customers spent their last dimes on popcorn while debating whether they could afford a movie ticket. The first major theater to break ranks was the Midwest Theater chain in 1931, though they did it secretly at first. They allowed a vendor to set up in an unused coat room, taking a percentage of sales rather than charging rent. Within a month, the popcorn revenue exceeded the profit from ticket sales. The manager immediately installed machines in 3 more locations, still keeping it quiet from competitors. Corporate records show they called it auxiliary revenue in their books, apparently too embarrassed to write popcorn sales. The transformation accelerated as theaters discovered something remarkable. People would pay premium prices inside the theater. That 5-cent bag on the street became a 10-cent bag in the lobby, and customers didn't complain. The markup was pure profit since theaters had lower costs than street vendors. No wagon rental, no weather problems, no police permits. A study by the Motion Picture Herald in 1932 found that concession sales could increase a theater's profit by 40%, sometimes making the difference between survival and closure. But the cultural shift required careful orchestration. Theaters couldn't just start selling popcorn. They had to maintain their prestige while embracing what they'd previously rejected. Some created separate refreshment parlors with their own entrances, allowing patrons to purchase snacks without contaminating the main lobby. Others installed elaborate ventilation systems, not for health reasons, but to direct popcorn aroma toward the street, attracting customers while claiming they were removing odors. The engineering reports from these installations, preserved in architectural archives, show more thought went into popcorn ventilation than into fire safety. The resistance from traditional theater staff was fierce. Ushers who'd been trained to spot and eject snack smugglers suddenly had to sell the very items they'd been confiscating. Projectionists complained about grease spots on film from popcorn-buttered fingers touching the screen. Cleaning staff threatened strikes over the additional work, though in the Depression, strike threats carried less weight when replacement workers lined up by the hundreds. A former usher from the Chicago theater recalled, decades later, feeling like a butler being asked to tend bar at a speakeasy. Independent theater owners moved faster than chains, having less corporate dignity to preserve. The Gem Theater in rural Illinois installed a popcorn machine in 1932 and immediately offered all-you-can-eat popcorn Tuesdays, which proved so popular they had to limit it to 1 bag per customer after nearly running out of corn. Small-town theaters discovered popcorn could subsidize ticket prices, keeping admission at 10 cents while making 15 cents per customer on concessions. This model, documented in trade publications, became the template for theater economics that persists today. The popcorn itself evolved to meet theater requirements. Street vendor popcorn was often tough and heavily salted for preservation, but theaters could pop fresh and control quality. They experimented with different butter blends, coconut oil for better flavor, special salts that adhered better. A concession supplier's catalog from 1934 offers 17 different theater-grade popcorn varieties, each claiming superior expansion rates or taste profiles. The scientific descriptions read like wine reviews. Notes of roasted hazelnut with a clean finish, though it was still just exploded corn with butter. The architectural impact was substantial. Theaters built between 1933 and 1940 included concession stands in their original designs, no longer afterthoughts, but central features. The Senator Theater in Baltimore installed a popcorn machine in a glass booth in the center of the lobby, making the popping process part of the entertainment. The mechanical spectacle that Charles Creeders had pioneered on street corners became high theater, literally, with some venues adding colored lights and mirrors to create popcorn theaters within theaters. Training manuals from the period reveal how seriously theaters took concession optimization. Employees learned to pop during quiet scenes to avoid disturbing dialogue, to add butter in view of customers to justify higher prices, to slightly oversalt early evening batches to encourage drink sales. One manual from 1935 dedicates 12 pages to the art of suggestive selling, including recommended phrases like, "Our fresh popped corn would complement your evening perfectly," which sounds absurdly formal for selling snacks, but apparently worked. The economic data is staggering. By 1935, theaters that had fought popcorn were completely dependent on it. The RKO chain's annual report showed concession revenue, primarily popcorn, accounting for half their total profit. Some theaters actually lost money on tickets, surviving entirely on popcorn sales. This led to what economists now call the popcorn economy, where the nominal product, movies, serves primarily to deliver customers to the actual profit center, concessions. Religious and moral objections persisted in some communities. Church groups complained that eating in theaters promoted gluttony and distracted from artistic appreciation. Some newspapers ran editorials about the vulgarization of cinema through popcorn sales. The Catholic Legion of Decency, which already rated movies for moral content, briefly considered rating theaters based on their concession policies, though this proved too ridiculous even for them. The debate seems quaint now, but people genuinely worried that popcorn would destroy American culture instead of becoming inseparable from it. But as theater owners counted their popcorn profits and avoided bankruptcy, world events were about to make their success even sweeter, literally. War was coming, and with it would come sugar rationing that would transform popcorn from a profitable sideline into America's primary snack food. The marriage of convenience between movies and popcorn was about to become something much deeper. You're reading a ration book in 1942. Running your finger down the list of restricted items: sugar, coffee, butter, meat, practically everything that makes food taste good. But there's no mention of popcorn. While candy factories shut down and soda fountains serve bitter substitutes, corn kernels remain unlimited, unrationed, gloriously available. What started as a wartime restriction accidentally handed popcorn the keys to American snack culture, and consumption tripled before anyone quite realized what was happening. The sugar rationing that began in April 1942 devastated the confectionery industry almost overnight. Hershey's converted their production to military rations, candy stores closed by the thousands, and Americans faced the prospect of years without their sweet treats. Each person received about half a pound of sugar per month, barely enough for coffee, let alone candy making. But popcorn required no sugar unless you wanted it sweet, and most people had learned to love it with just butter and salt, both of which remained relatively available, though butter had its own complications. What nobody anticipated was the psychological effect. Americans needed comfort food during wartime, something familiar and indulgent while their world transformed around them. Popcorn filled that void perfectly. It was entertainment when entertainment was scarce, luxury when luxury was impossible, normalcy when nothing felt normal. A Woman's Diary from 1943 Detroit, donated to the National Archives, mentions popcorn 17 times in 6 months, usually in contexts like popped corn for the children to lift their spirits, or shared popcorn while listening to war news. The agricultural response was swift and dramatic. Farmers who'd been growing sweet corn switched to popcorn varieties, correctly predicting sustained demand. The USDA's War Food Administration, which normally controlled crop allocation, actively encouraged popcorn production as morale essential agriculture. That classification seems almost absurd, putting popcorn alongside vitamins and proteins, but declassified documents show they were serious. Internal memos discuss popcorn's role in maintaining civilian contentment during prolonged conflict, which is government speak for keeping people happy enough not to complain. Theater attendance surged during the war. Americans craving escape from daily anxieties, and popcorn sales followed. But here's where it gets interesting. Theaters discovered they could sell even more popcorn when they marketed it as patriotic. By popcorn, Support America became a common slogan, suggesting that purchasing concessions somehow aided the war effort. The logical connection was tenuous at best, but people wanted to feel they were contributing, and if that meant eating more popcorn, they were willing to sacrifice. The military itself became a massive popcorn consumer. Training camps ordered popcorn machines for recreation halls, considering them essential for morale. The Navy installed poppers on larger vessels, though submarine crews had to make do without for obvious reasons. Letters from soldiers consistently mention missing American popcorn, leading to care package programs specifically for shipping popped corn overseas. The logistics of sending pre-popped corn to combat zones seem insane, but the Quartermaster Corps took it seriously enough to develop special moisture-proof packaging. Home popping evolved during rationing in creative ways. With butter restricted, Americans experimented with alternatives. Bacon grease became a popular popping medium, giving popcorn a smoky, meaty flavor that some people preferred to butter. Recycled cooking oils, saved from other meals, found new life in popcorn preparation. A 1944 cookbook called Wartime Popcorn Magic offered 50 recipes using available ingredients, including popcorn popped in fish oil, which probably tasted exactly as appealing as it sounds. The corn syrup industry, not subject to the same restrictions as sugar, saw an opportunity. They developed special popcorn coatings that created sweet versions without using precious sugar rations. These syrups didn't quite replicate candy, but they satisfied sweet cravings enough to become popular. Cracker Jack actually thrived during the war by emphasizing their syrup coating, marketing themselves as the candy-coated popcorn that doesn't need sugar rationing, though that wasn't entirely accurate since they did use some sugar, just less than pure candy. Children became popcorn entrepreneurs at unprecedented levels. With candy scarce and popcorn plentiful, kids could make serious money selling homemade popcorn balls at school events. The Office of Price Administration, which regulated wartime prices, initially tried to control popcorn pricing, but gave up when they realized it was impossible to regulate millions of home poppers. A frustrated OPA memo from 1943 complains about the anarchic nature of popcorn economics, which might be the best description of free market capitalism ever written by a government bureaucrat. The social dynamics shifted remarkably. Popcorn parties replaced dinner parties as entertaining became difficult with food restrictions. Families would gather around radios, sharing bowls of popcorn while listening to war updates or comedy shows. These gatherings required no ration stamps, minimal preparation, and created community during isolation. Sociologists studying wartime behavior, in papers published years later, identified popcorn consumption as a measurable indicator of social cohesion. Neighborhoods with higher popcorn sales showed stronger civilian defense participation. Women's magazines promoted popcorn as a versatile wartime food. Good Housekeeping published articles on popcorn nutrition, vastly overstating its protein content, but correctly identifying it as whole grain. Ladies' Home Journal offered popcorn crafts, stringing it for decorations when Christmas ornaments became unavailable. These magazines performed impressive mental gymnastics to present popcorn as simultaneously healthful, decorative, and patriotic, though readers probably just appreciated having something unrationed to enjoy. The black market that developed around many ration goods never really touched popcorn, because why would it? It remained cheap, legal, and abundant. This created an unusual economic situation where one of the few unregulated pleasures became culturally central. Some historians argue that popcorn's exemption from rationing permanently changed American snacking habits, embedding it so deeply in daily life that consumption never decreased after the war ended. Corporate innovation accelerated despite, or perhaps because of, wartime restrictions. Companies developed new popping technologies that used less fuel, important when energy was precious. Packaging improved to extend shelf life without refrigeration. Hybrid corn varieties were developed specifically for home popping efficiency. The Patent Office recorded more popcorn-related inventions between 1942 and 1945 than in the previous decade, though most were variations on how to pop corn with whatever fuel you have available. The statistics are staggering. American popcorn consumption rose from 1.5 pounds per person in 1941 to 4.8 pounds by 1945. That might not sound like much, but it represents billions of individual kernels, each one popped during history's darkest period, tiny explosions of normalcy in abnormal times. Theater owners reported that popcorn sales per customer tripled, partially because there wasn't much else to buy, partially because eating popcorn had become almost ritualistic, a small act of defiance against deprivation. As 1945 drew to a close and victory approached, sugar would soon return to American tables. Candy production would resume, soda fountains would flow again, and every sweet treat would reappear. But popcorn had claimed territory it would never surrender. The generation that grew up during the war considered popcorn essential, not emergency food, but comfort food, not rationing survival, but American tradition. And just as this transformation solidified, someone in Minnesota was about to revolutionize popcorn again, this time bringing it from theaters into every American kitchen. You're watching Frederick Menon in his Minnesota kitchen in 1958, fumbling with a piece of aluminum foil that keeps tearing when he tries to fold it. He's been at this for months, trying to create a disposable pan that can contain popping corn without burning the bottom or letting kernels escape. His wife thinks he's lost his mind. The garbage is full of failed prototypes, and he's spent their savings on industrial aluminum. But tonight, something different happens. The folded pan expands upward instead of outward, creating a dome that self-vents steam while keeping kernels contained. The Jiffy Pop age is about to begin, though first he'll need to convince America they want to shake a pan over a stove for entertainment. The path from Menon's invention in 1959 to nationwide distribution was anything but smooth. Grocery stores didn't know where to stock it. Was it with baking supplies, snacks, or aluminum goods? The price, 79 cents, seemed outrageous when raw kernels cost pennies. Early television commercials showed families gathered around the stove watching the aluminum dome expand, but test audiences complained it looked dangerous, like it might explode. The marketing team had to add reassuring voiceovers explaining that the expansion was controlled and completely safe, though several house fires in 1960 suggested otherwise when people forgot to shake the pan. What Jiffy Pop actually sold wasn't just popcorn, it was theater in your own kitchen. The expanding aluminum dome became mesmerizing family entertainment, Children would gather to watch it grow, making bets on how high it would rise. The product instructions, preserved in packaging museums, read like stage directions: shake continuously in a circular motion, maintain steady heat, listen for the crescendo of popping. This wasn't cooking, it was performance art with a snack at the end. Meanwhile, in Indiana, a peculiar agricultural perfectionist named Orville Redenbacher was developing something completely different. While Menon focused on packaging, Redenbacher obsessed over the kernels themselves. He spent 20 years, from 1945 to 1965, crossbreeding thousands of corn varieties to create the perfect popping kernel. His neighbors thought he was insane, measuring expansion ratios, counting unpopped kernels, analyzing hull thickness. His personal notebooks, donated to Purdue University, contain measurements of over 30,000 individual kernels, each cataloged with the dedication of a museum curator. Redenbacher's breakthrough came from understanding that moisture content was everything. Most popcorn contain 12 to 14% moisture, but his hybrids maintained exactly 13.5%, the sweet spot for maximum expansion with minimum hulls. He developed kernels that expanded to 40 times their original size, compared to the standard 25 to 30 times. The difference seems minor on paper, but in practice it meant fluffier popcorn with fewer dental hazards. Though explaining kernel expansion ratios in marketing materials proved challenging, consumers just knew it tasted better. The real revolution came in 1981 when General Mills received a patent for microwave popcorn, though the journey there was bizarre. The concept existed since 1945 when Percy Spencer accidentally melted a chocolate bar with radar waves and wondered what else might cook. But early microwave popcorn attempts failed spectacularly. Bags caught fire, kernels scorched, and the popcorn tasted like cardboard. The breakthrough required a susceptor, a metallized film that concentrated microwave energy, essentially recreating the hot oil effect without oil. The patent documents describe it in mind-numbing technical detail, but basically they figured out how to trick corn into thinking it was in a pot. The microwave popcorn bag itself became an engineering marvel. It needed to withstand pressure without exploding, vent steam without losing kernels, and stand upright while popping. The solution involved precise folding patterns, special adhesives that released at specific temperatures, and paper that wouldn't ignite despite containing what was essentially aluminum foil. A single bag involved 17 different patents, more intellectual property than some automobiles, all to pop corn in 3 minutes. The cultural impact was immediate and profound. By 1985, microwave popcorn sales exceeded all other forms combined. Office workers popped bags during breaks, creating what workplace consultants called olfactory disruption, fancy words for complaining about the smell. Some companies banned microwave popcorn, others installed special ventilation, and a few embraced it as a morale booster. IBM's corporate handbook from 1987 actually includes a section on appropriate popcorn etiquette in shared workspaces, suggesting the issue reached surprisingly high levels of corporate concern. Home consumption patterns transformed completely. Families no longer needed to plan popcorn. They could have it instantly. This spontaneity changed viewing habits. People would start movies knowing they could pause for popcorn anytime. Video rental stores began stocking microwave popcorn at checkout, creating an inseparable link between home entertainment and popcorn. Blockbuster Video reported in 1990 that popcorn was their highest margin product, beating even late fees, which is saying something considering their late fee reputation. The butter flavoring controversy that emerged in the 1990s revealed how artificial the experience had become. The butter was actually diacetyl, a chemical that tastes buttery but caused serious lung problems for factory workers exposed to high concentrations. Popcorn lung became an actual medical diagnosis, leading to lawsuits, reformulations, and public anxiety about microwave popcorn safety. Companies scrambled to develop natural butter flavoring, though reading the ingredient list suggests natural is highly subjective. Competition intensified as brands multiplied. By 1995, grocery stores stocked dozens of varieties: movie theater butter, kettle corn, white cheddar, caramel, and inexplicably ranch flavor. Each claimed superiority through increasingly absurd metrics: percentage of kernels popped, expansion volume, whole tenderness. Pop Secret advertised laboratory-tested popping perfection, while Act II claimed cinema-quality reproduction, though neither explained what those phrases actually meant. The packaging arms race produced memorable innovations and failures. Remember the color-changing bags that turned blue when ready? They lasted 6 months before people realized the chemical reaction had nothing to do with doneness. Or the self-buttering bags with butter packets that melted during popping. Great idea until the packets occasionally exploded, coating microwave interiors with greasy yellow film. Each failure taught lessons, mainly that consumers wanted simplicity disguised as innovation. Environmental concerns in the 2000s challenged the industry again. The bags weren't recyclable. The palm oil raised deforestation questions, and the energy usage seemed wasteful for such a simple snack. Companies responded with eco-friendly versions, though these often just meant lighter packaging around the same product. Some brands introduced compostable bags, which worked great unless you actually tried to compost them, when you discover they required industrial composting facilities that didn't exist in most communities. By 2010, Americans were consuming over 17 billion quarts of popcorn annually, with about 70% popped at home. The transformation from street vendor novelty to kitchen staple was complete. Every demographic consumed popcorn. Every store stocked it. Every microwave could make it. What started as Frederick Menon shaking aluminum over a flame had become a multi-billion-dollar industry. Though the basic principle remained unchanged: heat corn until it explodes. But the story doesn't end with convenience and consumption. As food science advanced and cultural tastes evolved, popcorn would undergo one more transformation. The ancient grain that indigenous peoples first popped, that survived the Depression and won the war, was about to become gourmet. And, surprisingly, the science of why it pops at exactly 356 degrees would finally be understood. You're watching a high-speed camera capture a single kernel at exactly 356 degrees Fahrenheit, and what you see defies expectation. The hull doesn't just crack, it inverts completely in less than a millisecond, turning itself inside out like a biological explosion. Scientists at Cornell University spent years filming this transformation at 20,000 frames per second, finally understanding in 2015 what indigenous peoples discovered 6,000 years ago through trial and error. The kernel needs precisely 14 to 20% moisture content, creating steam pressure of 135 pounds per square inch until the hull catastrophically fails and the starch matrix erupts into that familiar white flour. It's violent botanical poetry, happening 17 billion times per year in American kitchens and theaters. The gourmet popcorn revolution that began in the 2000s seems almost inevitable in retrospect. Once Americans understood the science, entrepreneurs realized they could engineer completely new experiences. Garrett Popcorn in Chicago started mixing cheese and caramel in 1988, creating Chicago Mix that food critics initially mocked as aggressively American, but now sells for $40 per gallon in Tokyo department stores. The profit margins are staggering. Corn that costs 2 cents becomes a $60 gift tin, alchemy that would impress medieval philosophers. What's particularly fascinating about modern popcorn culture, and food anthropologists are just beginning to study this, is how it transcended its snack category to become experiential luxury. Gourmet shops offer truffle parmesan popcorn at $30 per pound, bourbon caramel varieties aged in oak barrels, even gold leaf dusted kernels for weddings. A store in Los Angeles sells small batch artisanal popcorn for more per ounce than sterling silver, though whether anyone can actually taste the difference from regular butter flavor remains highly debatable. The science keeps revealing surprises. Researchers at the French National Center for Scientific Research discovered in 2015 that popcorn's pop sound comes from water vapor jets escaping the kernel, not from the hull cracking as everyone assumed. They calculated the acoustic frequency, around 6,000 hertz, and determined each kernel produces a unique sound signature based on its moisture content and hull thickness. This means every piece of popcorn literally sings its own song, that you'd need sophisticated equipment to tell them apart. Modern agricultural techniques have pushed popcorn beyond what Orville Redenbacher imagined. New hybrids expand to 50 times their original size. Some naturally colored varieties pop into pink or blue flowers, and researchers are developing kernels with built-in flavoring compounds that activate during popping. The USDA maintains a popcorn germplasm repository in Iowa with over 2,000 varieties, preserving genetic diversity that might seem excessive for a snack food, but represents agricultural heritage spanning millennia. The economic footprint is remarkable. The popcorn industry generates over $10 billion annually in the United States alone, supporting 40,000 farms and countless related businesses. Nebraska grows more popcorn than any other state, producing 350 million pounds per year from fields that stretch beyond the horizon. These aren't small family plots. Modern popcorn farming involves GPS-guided combines, moisture sensors accurate to 0.1%, and contracts negotiated on global commodity markets. The transformation from indigenous crop to industrial commodity is complete, though the basic biology remains unchanged. Theater chains remain completely dependent on popcorn economics. AMC Theaters reported in 2019 that concessions, primarily popcorn, generated profit margins of 85% compared to 5% on ticket sales. Some analysts argue theaters are essentially popcorn stores that happen to show movies, a complete reversal from the 1920s when owners thought popcorn would destroy their businesses. The pandemic of 2020 proved this dependence, when theaters sold popcorn for delivery just to generate revenue while closed, discovering people would pay $15 for movie theater popcorn even without the movie. Cultural variations have proliferated globally. Japanese consumers prefer light, barely salted popcorn. Germans love it sweet with sugar coatings. Indians add curry and chili powder, while Mexicans squeeze lime and add hot sauce. Each culture has adapted this fundamentally American snack to local tastes, though Americans themselves keep inventing new variations. Pickle-flavored popcorn somehow exists, as does birthday cake flavor, proving there's no limit to what people will try. The flavoring technology itself has become sophisticated, using encapsulation techniques that release taste in stages, creating what food scientists call flavor journeys, though most people just call it popcorn. The technology continues evolving in unexpected directions. Smart microwaves now have popcorn buttons that actually work, using acoustic sensors to count pops and determine optimal completion. Silicone microwave bowls let people pop plain kernels without bags, addressing environmental concerns while giving control over flavoring. Air poppers have made a comeback among health-conscious consumers, producing naked popcorn with 30 calories per cup, though most people immediately drown it in butter anyway, somewhat defeating the purpose, but nobody seems to care. Scientific research has revealed unexpected health benefits. Popcorn contains more antioxidants per serving than most fruits, concentrated in the whole pieces everyone hates getting stuck in their teeth. It's the only snack that's 100% whole grain, providing fiber most Americans desperately need. Nutritionists now recommend it as a healthy snack, assuming you don't add the stick of butter and salt lick that makes it taste good. The polyphenol concentration is particularly impressive, rivaling that of nuts and dark chocolate, though explaining polyphenol to consumers proved so difficult that marketers gave up and just started calling it superfood popcorn. Environmental initiatives are reshaping the industry again. Companies are developing biodegradable packaging, investigating mushroom-based materials that could replace traditional bags. Some farms are experimenting with regenerative agriculture, using popcorn as a rotation crop that improves soil health. There's even research into capturing the steam from industrial popping to generate energy, though the economics don't quite work yet. Carbon footprint calculations show popcorn has surprisingly low environmental impact compared to other snacks, mainly because corn grows efficiently and popping requires minimal processing, though shipping all that air inside popped kernels seems inefficient. The cultural impact keeps deepening beyond commerce. Popcorn has its own museum in Marion, Ohio, multiple festivals nationwide, including the Valparaiso Popcorn Festival that draws 65,000 visitors, and academic conferences where researchers present papers on optimal popping dynamics. There's a World Popcorn Day every January 19th, presumably because someone decided we needed one. Food historians now study popcorn as a lens for understanding American culture, tracking social changes through consumption patterns and flavor preferences, finding correlations between economic anxiety and butter-flavored sales. Looking at the complete journey, we've turned a survival food into entertainment, a nickel depression snack into luxury commodity, an indigenous discovery into global phenomenon. Every kernel that pops carries 6,000 years of history, from Peruvian caves through Aztec ceremonies, colonial struggles through breakfast bowls, street corners through movie palaces, war rations through kitchen convenience. The same reaction that amazed ancient peoples still captivates children watching Jiffy Pop expand, still fills theaters with anticipation-building aroma, still provides comfort during difficult times. The statistics tell their own story. Americans consume roughly 68 quarts per person annually, enough popcorn to fill the Empire State Building 900 times over. We've mechanized the process, industrialized the agriculture, corporatized the distribution, yet at its core, popcorn remains what it's always been. Corn plus heat equals magic. The simplest pleasure that requires precise physics, the humblest grain that built a $10 billion empire, still popping at exactly 356 degrees Fahrenheit, the temperature at which corn transcends its boundaries and becomes something impossible, edible architecture built from steam and starch, a delicious explosion that connects us across centuries, cultures, and continents. And tonight, as you've listened to this story unfold, perhaps your own memories of popcorn have surfaced, drifting through your mind like kernels in hot oil. First movies attended with nervous dates, family gatherings around massive bowls, the specific way your grandmother made it with real butter on the stove, or that one perfect batch from a street vendor you'll never quite find again. These memories matter. They're part of the continuing story, each pop connecting us to everyone who's ever held a kernel over flame and waited for the magic. The night has grown quiet now. Your breathing has probably slowed, matching the rhythm of these words. And somewhere in the gentle darkness, you might imagine you can almost hear it, that distinctive sound of kernels surrendering to heat. Pop, 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 gradually slowing down like thoughts before sleep, each explosion softer than the last. The intervals growing longer, more peaceful, until only silence remains and the faint, comforting memory of butter and salt. Tomorrow you might see popcorn differently. Notice the precise engineering of a microwave bag. Appreciate the agricultural heritage in each kernel. Remember the desperate Depression vendors selling hope for a nickel, or Frederick Menon shaking his aluminum invention over a flame. Or perhaps you'll simply enjoy it exactly as you always have, uncomplicated and perfect, the way the best things often are, without needing to think about Aztec ceremonies or steam pressure or the 40,000 farms that made it possible. Let your mind drift now, like steam escaping from a kernel, rising slowly, dissipating into peaceful darkness. You've traveled through centuries tonight, witnessed transformations both mechanical and cultural, discovered secrets hidden in plain sight, from ancient Peruvian caves to modern gourmet shops. And now it's time to rest, to let these stories settle into dreams, where indigenous farmers might share their popping techniques in whispers, where Charles Creeders pushes his steam wagon through clouds, where every kernel holds a universe of possibility, waiting at exactly 356 degrees. Close your eyes. Let your body sink deeper into comfort, feeling heavier with each breath. The weight of history and snacks and gentle stories pulling you down, down, towards sleep. The popcorn has all been popped. The stories have all been told, and you can rest now, carried by the quiet knowledge that some of humanity's greatest pleasures come from the simplest discoveries, corn and heat and time, transformed into something wonderful, something that connects us all. Sleep well. Dream of white flowers blooming from golden kernels, of movie theaters glowing in the darkness, street corners alive with steam and aroma, kitchen experiments on rainy afternoons. Let the sound of distant popping fade into the rhythm of your breathing, slower now, softer, deeper, until morning comes again, bringing with it new stories, new possibilities, and perhaps, just perhaps, a fresh bowl of popcorn, waiting to create new memories, new moments, in the endless story that continues, kernel by kernel, pop by pop, into tomorrow.